75% of the people she questioned thought that Britain was a Muslim country. Not because they wanted it to be a Muslim country, because they actually thought it was a Muslim country, because all they saw were people of their own community, because there was no mixing beyond. That was, one of the most striking ones. But many other examples of, women not participating in the workforce, lack of English being spoken, things like that that are necessary for social cohesion to flourish.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK. Since the murder of Sir David Amess, the MP, Islamic fundamentalism has been the elephant in the room. With laudable speeches on combating online abuse of MPs, the issue of radicalisation and extremism has barely been discussed. Now, whilst of course a right to a fair trial could be partly responsible for some MPs perhaps keeping their cards close to their chest, we all know by now that the culprit here is more than just a few tweets or indeed Facebook posts. For more content like this, please do consider hitting the like button and the notification bell to make sure that you don't miss out on any future content. Now, joining me to discuss today's topic, I'm absolutely delighted to say, is the Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society, Dr. Alan Mendoza. Hello, Dr. Alan Mendoza. How are you?
I am good, Darren. How are you?
I'm marvellous, thank you. All the better for seeing you. Now, what did you make of the public response? We'll start with the public response instead of the MP response. Do you think the public are sort of becoming desensitised, Alan, to these sorts of, horrendous crimes?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, Darren. I mean, I think you look at this, you start from the perspective of, look, an atrocity occurs, and this is an atrocity, a member of parliament brutally murdered while conducting a constituency surgery. And you begin to then, look around and go, well, where's the outrage? I mean, obviously there's sadness. I mean, we're all sad at the issue, but this is not, an MP being hit by a bus. This isn't even, I hate to say it, an MP, dying of coronavirus. It's an MP murdered by what appears to be a fundamentalist who was conducting an act in the name of religion. And surely there should be a lot more outrage from the public about that aspect, and certainly from the politicians as well. But I think it does depend on where you are. I mean, I've been on numerous, shows in the last week, and the commentary coming in from ordinary people on social media, at least, is fairly different to what you might read in the media and in Westminster. So while you may have this sort of general divide, some people are focusing on, obviously, the man himself and his many achievements, and that's to be encouraged. There are others who are not blind to the fact that something has gone on here and that the political class doesn't want to talk about it. And we've seen that before, haven't we, Darren?
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. I'm wondering then because I'm hearing this disconnect as well between what parliamentarians are saying and what the public are saying. Why is it that there seems to be in that House of Commons, where you are right, you had these beautiful tributes, and of course there's a place for that. Of course you must do that. But there's also this ginormous elephant in the room where British culture, and I guess those holding the power in Britain, seem to want to avoid this ginormous elephant in the room. And that is one of, how do we combat Islamic fundamentalism? How do we ensure that these sort of attacks don't happen again? That's what the public want to be talking about. Whilst you're absolutely right, there is a case for hearing people's tributes and all the rest of it. How do we actually ensure that in Britain in 2021, this sort of attack doesn't become the norm, right? This sort of attack, we don't just sort of expect this thing to happen to our parliamentarians. Surely if you're an MP, you're going to be pretty bloody concerned at the moment, aren't you, about your own safety perhaps?
Well, yes, you are. And I think you look at this as an MP and you go, well, where are the threats likely to come from? I thought it was fascinating, actually, this Sunday. The Sunday Times wrote what, in my view, was a fairly disingenuous piece, actually, looking at a story that the police had told MPs who wanted to oppose religious slaughter, but they use the term Jewish and Muslim religious slaughter, that they need to perhaps beef up their security because they may face threats. Now, I don't know about you, Darren, but I haven't met many militant Jews who are willing to, kind of kill people on the grounds of ritual slaughter and opposing it. So we know there's a threat there. MPs are fully aware of where the threat is from, but there is a fear factor, isn't there, about talking about this? And I think the fear factor, comes into two or three different reasons. The first fear factor is literally the fear of, if I raise my head about the parapet, I become a target. I think we're still unclear, obviously, why Sir David was targeted. It was clear that the man who's been charged now was, he was actually looking at several different MPs, spending as much as 2 years trying to work out who to attack. We don't yet know why he was attacked, but MPs will be looking around, going, "Do I want to position myself as a target?" Now, we would hope our political leadership would be happy to do what is right, regardless of what might not be. But I can understand, why some people might not want to profile themselves in that way. The second issue is the chilling effect of a particular charge that has become fairly widespread in the last few years. And this is something called Islamophobia, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And you may well have been called an Islamophobe, quite possibly, certainly will be after this programme. But the point of this is that it is a charge used by radical Muslims in particular to chill debate around anything that touches around the realm of Islam. And in that, it's very different to something which I would call anti-Muslim hatred. And anti-Muslim hatred is clearly a form of either race hatred or religious hatred, depending on how you look at it, and is something I'm sure all of us oppose. We don't want anyone targeted for their religion, and anyone who does target someone for their religion should be immediately tackled with the full force of the law. However, those people who peddle this Islamophobia analogy basically say that any discussion about Islam in any way, shape or form, which might offend any particular Muslim at any given time, is racism. And we can't discuss it. Now, of course, the effect of this is to mean that when you raise issues of radical Islam, as opposed to moderate Islam, the Islam that most people in the world practice, you end up with the charge being hurled at you that you are a racist for daring to suggest there might be some problem with radical Islam. Now, any sensible person out there knows there's a problem with radical Islam. They knows there's a problem with any form of extreme religion that wants to live separately, but particularly a form of extreme religion where some people interpret it as literally killing their neighbours or going around and stabbing MPs at this sort of setup. I mean, these are, this is an obvious problem. But MPs are scared of being called racist. The greatest crime in Britain today, is not murder or rape. It is being called racist, it would appear, given the fear that some people have of being labelled that. And again, that's a chilling effect. It means that people aren't willing to do that. And the third reason, I suppose, is it is by far the hardest of the subjects to tackle. If you look at, this versus social media anonymity, which was the big, kind of shout that came up after the murder, what's tougher? Sanctioning some media companies or actually looking at root and branch reform in marginalised communities in this country and trying to work out how to improve social cohesion within the UK. It's clear the latter is much harder, and there's always a tendency to go for the low-hanging fruit when you're making, kind of political points. But the challenge now is to go, look, what is ultimately going to lead to greater security for the greatest number of people in this country? And clearly that is stopping any form of radical ideology that threatens social cohesion in this country, threatens national unity, and which, of course, in this particular case, also lends itself to violence on the streets.
Yeah, I'm really struck by that point that you raised there about the reason being that people are so fearful of being called these sort of isms or phobias. And there's a whole slew of them, Alan, as you well know, as a route, as a tool to shut down speech and debate. Now, I'm wondering then, can anything really be done to prevent lone wolf attacks? Because the problem, Alan, as I see it, and I might be wrong on this, it seems to be that those that commit atrocities on British soil they tend to be known to the authorities, right? This guy had been referred to the Prevent programme, and this isn't the first instance of this sort of phenomenon. So what can actually be done ultimately? Because without becoming a sort of, a Chinese-like state, a police state, what can we actually do?
Well, you again raise a great point, which is that it is very, very rare. It does happen occasionally, but it is very, very rare for someone to be radicalized in such a short amount of time that it's not picked up. In the case of, the man charged with Sir David Amess's murder, he had been picked up many years ago on the Prevent programme. So it was well known that he had potential issues many years ago. And people, no doubt, could have monitored him in the period and gone, actually, there were continuing issues in that way. So there are points of inflection when you can actually look at people and go, their behaviour's changed. They're saying some very unusual things. They're hanging out with the wrong people. All I see is that they're downloading videos, of Anjan Chowdhury. I mean, there are giveaways there. And so the points are, where are the intervention points the state can do to stop these things from happening? And lone wolves are, of course, one issue. I mean, we're assuming he's a lone wolf. We still don't know the full facts of the case. We know, for example, he was messaging people. Were those people he was working with, or were they just, random people? We don't know the details of the case, and nor will we for some time. But let's assume that, you have lone wolves that are going out on a constant basis. You have to spot the behavioral changes. Family, friends, community. These people are the best places to do that. And so you have to have a system, a prevent system essentially, that encourages compliance, encourages people coming forward, and will then, of course, take those people who are referred and deal with them appropriately, not let them back into the community if there's any doubt about the fact they might be radicalising in that way. So that's one half of the equation. That's a half basically of looking at the signs and trying to stop those people. But there's a second half of the equation as well, which is how do you go a step back even before then and drain the swamp, if you like, of extremism from which even the lone wolves can find material? Now, one step, of course, is to look online and go, there must be better ways for Facebook and for YouTube and others to go about and stop dangerous material being available to people. And when I say dangerous material, clearly Anjan Chowdhury's material, someone who's been in jail, for a crime related to support for terrorism, that's obviously dangerous. There's no value judgment that needs to be made on this, given he served a jail term for this. So I'm saying the easy options here, take out the people who are easy to take out, that those algorithms should be easy to adopt. I mean, it's disgraceful to find that last week you could find much of the stuff he'd been putting out prior to his trial and sentencing. But there's also another part of the equation as well, which is what are we doing in our communities in parts of the country which might have become ghettoized or segregated in some way? It's very popular at the moment, Darren, to talk about levelling up as an agenda. We hear it all the time. We want to level up, want to make sure that everyone is levelled up. Well, surely there is a need to level up marginalised communities in this country who have become monocultural because they've, kind of basically grown within an area, who have no contact with the dominant culture in this country, who may be operating different law codes, who may be operating different standards when it comes to women and others in that way, and who may not be integrated. You have to forget their local community, but with national life as well. Surely there is an urgent and pressing need to level up those communities. And I don't necessarily mean just, in the case of Muslim sort of segregated communities. There are many other segregated communities in this country that would benefit from an opening up and a levelling up to make sure they are participating fully in our civic, local and national life.
Do you think then that, because one thing we hear quite a lot about is that Islamophobia is a serious problem in Britain in 2021. On a sort of looking at the whole British picture, do you think radical Islam is the most serious problem that Britain faces now as far as terrorist threats concerned? Or do you actually think people have got a point in saying that this country is increasingly becoming Islamophobic and that's the new, where do you stand on that?
Well, firstly, as I said, I reject the term Islamophobia. It is a term that is wrong because it allows basically radical Muslims to control the agenda of what can and cannot be discussed. My term that I would use is anti-Muslim hatred, which is some that other moderate Muslims like to use as well, because they recognise that, by the way, they are normally the first victim of the radical Muslims. It's the moderate Muslims who are pressured by the radical Muslims in their local communities to conform to what they would like. And even they can often be called Islamophobic, but they can't be accused of being anti-Muslim. And so that's a key differential. Now, do I think, therefore, forget the Islamophobia issue, I think it's quite right that we question radical Islam. It's quite right we question any radical ideology in the UK, and it shouldn't be deemed a crime to do so or an offence to do so. Is there anti-Muslim hatred in the UK? Yes, there is. There's no doubt about it. It's wrong. We have to stand up against it. Everyone has to stand up against it. Muslim, non-Muslim, every decent person in this country should be out there standing in solidarity with Muslim, fellow citizens who face abuse on account of their race or religion. But does that alter the fact, that you've still got a massive, violent threat from radical Muslims in that community? The answer is no. It's there, and you don't need my analysis for that, because the MI5 watch list, the official watch list, tells you that is the case, Darren. If you look at I think it's 43,000 people are on that watch list. These are the very worst cases, the hardest nuts to crack, the people who it is assumed at some point may commit some kind of atrocity. Of that 43,000, roughly 90% have an extreme Muslim background. Now, that tells you where the terror threat is. And the other, I think, mistake we've made in the last 5 or 6 years since the tragic murder of Joe Cox, who was, of course, killed by a far right-wing extremist, is that we have consciously tried to shift the debate in the public away from radical Islam towards the far right. And you end up with ludicrous things happening, such as when there are, I think a few years ago, there was a BBC headline. There had been 21 terror threats that year, or 28 terror threats, something like that. A quarter of them were far right, and the other 3/4 were radical Muslim. Yet the BBC led with a quarter of terror threats are from the far right. Why? Because the politically correct agenda is to say that the far right are the easy targets. And of course, none of us like the far right. We all want to see them sort of knocked off the agenda. But it's much easier to do that than to say problems with radical Islam, problems with extreme variants of Islam in the UK. So we have to get away as well from this pretense that the far right is a greater threat. It's a fast-growing threat. We've seen the stats on that, that there is a growth in far-right extremism. But when it comes to the endpoint of security threats to this country, it is still, as you can see from that watch list, very heavily skewed in favour of radical Islam.
And I think that's where the public starts to get a little bit, shall we say, I think, unhappy would be putting it mildly, towards our politicians and actually much of the media class as well, when you do hear this narrative, a narrative that actually puts political correctness ahead of public safety. Right? And I think that's the frustration by much of the British people. That's, the frustration by many people that I imagine will comment and respond to this video. But I wonder...
Can I just say something about that? You're absolutely right. And it's particularly disastrous when politicians come out after a terrorist attack and say absurd things like, Islam is a religion of peace. Now, it's absurd not because you can't interpret Islam as a religion of peace. You can, and many Muslims do. But it is not for a non-Muslim person to come and give their stamp of approval or not on what a religion constitutes. It would be ludicrous for us to go and say, you are a good Muslim, you are a bad Muslim, based on our limited understanding of Islam. The reality is, and this is an important nuance people need to get, Islam is a textual religion. It is a religion based on texts and on things that are said and written down in that respect. Those texts are then interpreted. And it is perfectly possible to interpret one particular line of the Quran or the Hadith in one way if you want to be a radical who says, let's kill someone, and quite possible to interpret another way if you're a peaceful, normal person who doesn't want to do that and go, no, it doesn't mean lop off someone's head, it means X, Y, and Z instead. So the point is, interpretation matters when it comes to Islam, much with other religions. The problem for Islam is that there is no unifying figure or school of thought that can say this is Orthodox Islam. And as a result, for Western politicians to get up, non-Muslims to get up and say this is authentic Islam or this isn't authentic Islam, perpetuates a problem, and particularly perpetuates a problem because ordinary people, as you've just said, can go, how does that work? Some guy's just gone in, he says he's acting in the name of his religion. Who are you to say he isn't? And that's the problem. There's an obvious disconnect.
Yeah, there is. And I wonder then, is there an obvious disconnect on the balance of freedom and civil liberties, or freedom and security? That sort of, if we imagine, being two scales, and at the moment, I think a lot of people would be minded to say that it swings more one way than the other, who are genuinely concerned about this. But how do we get that balance right? I realise I'm asking you the million-dollar question here, but how do we get that balance right in the West, in liberal democracies? How do we ensure that we don't lose the very many benefits of being part of a liberal democracy, or in the pursuit of keeping us all safe, in the pursuit of ensuring, because I don't think anyone, for example, if you just name a few, airport security, for example, I don't think anyone would say, well, let's get rid of those checks at airports ever again. I don't think anyone would say that after the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester, that there shouldn't be greater checks and greater standards applied to security measures in places like that after children were murdered at that event, that horrible, horrible event. And even MP security as well, Alan. That will have to be reviewed now as well. Where do we strike the balance? Where do you think actually you can say that the civil liberties have to be curtailed in clamping down on extremism, for example? How do we ensure that we get that right?
Well, you are again right to highlight this whole issue that if you look at many of the demands that are made upon us now in daily life when we travel or visit places, they've been driven by terrorist attacks, of course. And we obviously understand why there needs to be these sort of different checks. And by the way, in different countries, there are different checks. If you go to, for example, Russia, if you enter not supermarkets, if you enter shopping centres, you're searched there. If you go to Spain, because of the Madrid bombings, if you go on a train, they will put you through all sorts of processes. There's a train between cities in Spain. So you'll get a reaction in different places to that, and people understand it. But the question I think you're asking is, how do we look at this question on a broader level, and how do we balance this in terms of the interventions we might need to do to kill off the radicalism issue versus obviously the need for civil liberties in Western liberal democracies? You can get this very wrong. To give you an example, a place where you can obviously see it's going wrong very badly is France. Now in France, because of the ghettoization, because of the policy, if you like, of literally throwing in lots of migrants into similar places, and then basically abandoning them, you've ended up with separate societies emerging in the banlieues and places like that. Separate societies where the rule of law of the French state doesn't really run, where police fear to tread, where radicalism is rampant, and where, unfortunately, terrorism emerges from. And you both see what the French now have to do to get a grip of it. They have to take extraordinary measures for a Western democracy. For example, they require the state certification of imams. They require the monitoring of Muslim organizations. They require all sorts. I mean, about the burqa ban. All these things have been put into a Western liberal democracy because they haven't been able to resolve this essential question that you were asking about: where should we, at an earlier stage, draw the line? And of course, in France, the end point is also that you get lots of presidential candidates emerging who want to be even tougher on French Muslims. Now, that is not an ideal situation to be in. You do not want to be in a place where you have one section of the population being treated different to another one, whether it is under extreme rule of similar people to them, or the state separating them from others and saying that we're going to treat you differently. That is the worst example for a liberal democracy to be following. So what can we do right now to stop us becoming France? Well, the key thing is we need action pretty quickly. And when I say action, I mean we have to have state intervention into communities that are in danger of being segregated and isolated, and we have to then, if you like, forcibly insert British values and the British way of doing things into those communities to
Alan,
stop them becoming
just
the
really
banlieue.
quickly on that point, are you worried then, because I know, for example, on the outskirts of Paris, right, there is a real ghettoization problem, right? There are real isolated communities. Do you fear, or are you perhaps about to say, well, Darren, don't be so naive because it's already like that? Do you fear that the UK is heading in that sort of direction, or are we there already?
I'm afraid we're there already.
Right.
It's not quite as bad as France because it hasn't happened in as many places. But if you look, if you were to take a day trip, and I encourage you to do this, and follow the path that you probably will have definitely come across Ed Hussein, the commentator and kind of think tank leader. Basically, Ed written a book recently about his experiences in lots of different British cities visiting Muslim communities. If you haven't read the book, read it. I'd encourage all of you to read it. It's Around the Mosque, it's called. And basically, he highlights the problems of segregation and monoculturalism in normal British cities. I'd also encourage you to look at a panorama that was done, I think, in 2019 in Blackburn. And it was a follow-up to a panorama that had been done 10 years beforehand. And it highlights a change in Blackburn, a pretty normal, kind of mill town, over a 10-year period. And you will see that increasing segregation has occurred. The town is at odds with each other. The white and the Muslim areas are at odds with each other. And you can see the problems that are being, kind of copied across various northern and Midlands places because of this phenomenon. So I'm afraid it's here already. Not quite as extreme as France, and we've got a chance to address it because it hasn't taken hold multi-generationally in the way that it has there, but we have a problem. So, as a result, how can we solve this? The good news is there are already plenty of plans out there that's sitting on the shelf waiting to be done and taken off. The first and most obvious one to do is something called the Casey Review, which was originally conducted in 2016 by Dame Louise Casey, now Baroness Casey. She had been tasked by the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, go out and look at this integration issue. Look across the UK, not on a religious basis, on a racial basis. Go and see what's happening in our cities and towns and report back. And she did report back. She reported back with some horrific findings. That, for example, in some parts of the city she'd visited, 75% of the people she questioned thought that Britain was a Muslim country. Not because they wanted it to be a Muslim country, because they actually thought it was a Muslim country, because all they saw were people of their own community, because there was no mixing beyond. That was, one of the most striking ones. But many other examples of, women not participating in the workforce, lack of English being spoken, things like that that are necessary for social cohesion to flourish, were not happening. And that was back in 2016. Now, she produced a report with some great recommendations about how the state can actually impose itself and break this up. The report has sat there on a shelf for 5 years for varying reasons, mainly because Brexit overtook things, number one, but secondly, because Cameron was gone as Prime Minister, others didn't have the same agenda in quite the same way. I think you've got an easy win by taking that review off the shelf, dusting it off and going, you know what, the problems haven't got better in 5 years, they've got worse. Because of course they get worse in that period if you do nothing about them. So let's go back to basics and let's actually bring those things in. Sarah Khan from the Countering Extremism Commission did another report a couple of years ago, again looking at how can we stop it? Again, the report is there. The recommendations haven't been acted upon. We don't need to reinvent the wheel on this, Darren. Right now, we can start with things that have been done, pieces of long work that have been done with great research, with good suggestions. Get started on the programme, but we need some political leadership to deliver on that.
What will it take then? Because people watching this will be saying, yes, of course, the British state should get involved in these sort of things and actually ensure that these sort of communities aren't, because that's an extraordinary finding, isn't it? That people think that this is a Muslim country. It would suggest that you don't watch the news either, or you don't watch any.
Well, you wouldn't watch the news in those communities. You wouldn't at all.
So that sort of thing is quite shocking. So therefore, it would suggest that you need some form of intervention in there. And I dare say most people watching this, apart from the British intelligentsia, or if there are any from the BBC or elsewhere watching this, I dare say they're not, Alan. They'll be wondering what on earth's going on here. Why are they just sat on their hands waiting for something else to happen? And by something else, I mean another atrocity.
Well, here's a challenge, isn't it? And by the way, I don't think you should assume who's watching it. You may be the guilty little pleasure of some BBC executives, who knows? But on a serious note, you look at this and you go, what is going to drive this? In reality, as with everything in politics, it is public pressure that is going to drive action. And, it's been public pressure over time that has driven, kind of the levelling up agenda now, the idea of the red wall. This is public pressure as experienced in voting and those sort of tactics. If people want to make this a priority, politicians will listen. So it actually is incumbent on people watching this show and others who feel passionate about this to make it known to their members of parliament that they demand action. And to, kind of when they're questioned in polls and things like this, to say, this is one of the most serious issues facing Britain today and I want action on it. It's only by doing that we're going to convince politicians there is actually a need to do it. Because what happens is you have an atrocity cycle, things happen, then very quickly they get forgotten about, and that cycle diminishes every time there is an atrocity. It gets forgotten about, and then you move on because it's easier just to kick these issues into the side and not deal with them. So we need to have the public pressure of people and voters saying, I demand action. I want to see action on this because I think it's important for this country to live more harmoniously than it is doing today.
Well, absolutely. Just finally, Alan, I wonder if we can focus on the foreign policy picture, because obviously there was the withdrawal from Afghanistan and now, of course, a resurgent Taliban, and a lot of concern around that seems to be, well, actually what you're going to see is further international pressure as far as terrorism is concerned, because it'll become a hotbed. That's the fear. Afghanistan becomes a hotbed of said terrorism, a safe haven for said terrorism. Are you concerned that the UK is going to see increased threats to its national security because of the withdrawal from Afghanistan in the shoddy and frankly negligent way, and as you've said many times before, that it was actually handled?
In a word, yes. I mean, the reality is we should never have left in the way we did. There's a question mark about whether we should have left at all, given that at this stage in the mission, we were managing to essentially pacify the country with about 5,000 US troops and, just being in bases and being able to monitor the situation. So there's that question full stop as to whether we should have gone. But look, we're out. What's the likelihood of what's going to happen? Well, we can already see what's happening. You've seen all the pictures of late in the news. You have this sort of situation that Afghanistan is sliding very quickly into failed state status. Mm-hmm. And when you have a failed state, when you have kind of pockets which are not governed by anyone, or when you have a state governed essentially by an extreme Islamic ideology like the Taliban, of course you're going to get space created for terrorists to function. And you've got two different problems here. The first set of problems are that you have the Taliban's long-standing and never renounced relationship with Al-Qaeda. And we think Al-Qaeda is finished as an entity. But you know what? It only needs a bit of time and space and support for it to come back up again as a major force. If the Taliban allow it to, under areas they control, then we will have the Al-Qaeda threat resume because they have the space to grow and develop. But we also have the ISIS threat. And, ISIS, as you know, is an offshoot from Al-Qaeda originally, which is opposed to the Taliban. It believes the Taliban is too weak, in fact, and too moderate in its approach. But ISIS functions and will try and gain control of various parts of Afghanistan for its own agenda. And it, too, will be able to use ungoverned spaces for its own purposes, to launch attacks. And crucially, of course, to act as a rallying cry, to show everyone, look, we're back, here we are, join us again. And that could, of course, lead to further radicalisation here in the UK, as well as attacks being planned from there in the UK. And so we have a very grave problem, which could have been avoided had we decided to keep the strategy of actually fighting the radicals over there, rather than having them come over here and fight us here.
I think this is a sort of related topic, but mainly, Alan, it's because I won't lie to you, I have a vested interest in it. I'm a Newcastle United fan myself, and I'm interested in hearing your view, actually, on, because I've heard you speak about, without sounding too much like a sycophant, I've watched you speak many times on issues like Huawei, for example, right? On Huawei's input in the UK's 5G infrastructure network, and why that would be an absolutely, frankly, if you pardon the French, batshit idea. You didn't quite couch it in those terms, but you know what I mean. Are you also worried then about the way in which the PIF of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian Sovereign Wealth Fund, now owning the likes of Newcastle United, where you've got this sort of sports washing, right? Where regimes around the world try and make themselves seem more palatable to domestic audiences here at home through accessing some of our biggest, football is our national sport. Where do you stand on that? Are the two things comparable, or do you think I'm way off the mark here?
They're not comparable for one basic reason. Firstly, I'm not a fan of the Saudi regime, and I don't believe they should have been allowed by the Premier League to take over a great and storied British football club like Newcastle United. I really think that a regime that has numerous human rights abuses, where it's unclear what this structure is in relation to the Saudi state. You can pretend all you like they're not involved with the club, but come on, we know the reality. Just as we know, by the way, the Qataris are involved, obviously, with the clubs they own and various others. So, is it wrong for human rights abusers, as you say, to sports wash? Yes, but there's a difference fundamentally, isn't there, between sports washing, which at the end of the day is a PR thing, and control of our critical national infrastructure, which is the sort of thing that Chinese companies have been up to. And as we know, Chinese companies are not independent of the Chinese state. And if you allow Chinese companies who have that link to the Chinese state to be, access if it's our telecoms or if it's our nuclear energy or anything that we depend on as a country, you run the risk that at some point the Chinese state tells that company, you're a Chinese company, don't care that you're independent or nominally independent, you're going to do what we say and you're going to cut off the power, or we're going to listen to what the Brits are saying, or we're going to interfere here and do that. And so on the critical infrastructure front, I wouldn't want a Saudi to own that, and I wouldn't want a Chinese company. I wouldn't want any dictatorship to own any of our critical national infrastructure, because fundamentally they are not aligned with where this country is and where we'll be going. We therefore always run the risk that when push comes to shove, in a blackmail style situation, we could be held over barrel by them. And that's, I think, the essential difference in the two cases.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that was just me wanting to hear your thoughts on a topic I was interested in, to be quite honest with you. But Alan, I think that's really a good place to end today's chat. Where can people find out more? Because the Henry Jackson Society has done masses of work on all of this stuff. Where can people find out more should they want to do so?
Well, thank you for saying that. Of course, we've done loads of work on the subject and many other subjects of interest, whether it is foreign policy or domestic risks, if you like, as well. So please go to our website, www.henryjacksonsociety.org. We are on all the major social media channels as well, and you're very welcome to follow me on Twitter at Alan Mendoza as well. But there's a lot of work out there. It's couched, I think, in terms that people understand easily and will get a reaction. And I think you'll find it most interesting to see what's happening in the world, but also what we can do about it.
It has been on a sort of refreshing point, I think, for me personally, to see how often GB News are having you on, actually, because I think a lot of broadcasters, Alan, as you might well agree, aren't so keen to talk about these topics. So it is great to see. But Alan Mendoza, thank you very much for giving up your time today.
A great pleasure, and hope to see you all again soon.
Now, please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell if you enjoyed today's content. I'm absolutely certain that you did, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching this video. Reasoned is a grassroots organisation that's entirely funded by people like yourself. So if you're in a position to do so, please do consider supporting us by clicking the link to the side there.